So I don't know why this is the case. I don't know why, but for some reason around Easter time, every year I end up doing a lot of funerals, like more funerals than normal around Easter. Same thing typically happens at Christmas time. And so I remember I was having a conversation with a couple of the guys in here. That one of them said, hey, you've been doing a lot of funerals lately. And I said, yeah, don't get any ideas. I don't know how well that went down. But I think there's something about it. And I don't know exactly why it is. This year through, around, give or take, the month around Easter time, we had 4 funerals, either connected to this congregation or connected to the congregation down in Burlington, where I'm interim moderator. So that's part of Easter, part of Holy Week, part of remembering and celebrating the resurrection was for many of us here and there, working our way through funerals. One thing that, as I reflect on this, I try to go through these moments of life, and on the one hand, you're just trying to push through because it's busy. And on the flip side, once you get through, I think it's good to try to reflect on what was that all about? And I find myself saying very similar things at each of these funerals. And so one of the things that I've found myself saying over and over again actually has less to do with, or it's less toward the immediate family or friends of the deceased. It's not speaking directly to the family, which again I like to try to do. It's actually speaking to those who gather in support, to other friends and family who are there, but who are maybe just a little bit more removed, once removed, however you want to figure that out, from the person who has died. And one of the things, like I said, that I end up saying over and over again to these folks is, yes, so there's a level of grief that you enter into with the funeral, but your primary reason, the primary reason for you being here is to support. And so what we need to understand at funerals, what we need to understand for those of us who gather to support the immediate loved ones, family, friends of the deceased, is that for a lot of us, we return very easily or very simply or very quickly to life as it was before the funeral, before the death. But you and I know that that is not the case for immediate friends, for immediate family of the deceased. That same return isn't possible. And that's not to doubt grief of those who gather or support and love of those who gather. It's just that you know that sometimes you go to a funeral and it's easy for you to walk away and re-enter your everyday routine in life. And for other people, you just know in those moments it's impossible. For children, nothing is the same once a parent has died. No matter how hard you try, no matter how normal it becomes, something is always going to be different. And so what I try to encourage those whose return is easier is to just simply remember that that's not the same for everyone. And the burden of support and the burden of care and the burden of love and prayer falls to those of us who move in and out a little easier to offer those things to the family, not just in the immediate day, not just the day of the funeral, but in the days after, and in the weeks ahead, and in the months, because we know that grief is a long road. And so what I've just noticed is that as I've done these funerals, some people move in easy and then move out easy, back to everyday life. And for some, nothing is ever the same again. So maybe you've been here through Easter, you've been at church, at worship through Easter, through the Easter season. And what I also find happens, is that for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, that same return post-Easter can be very easy. That's to say, we move into Easter, we move into all of the services and events of Holy Week, and you feel it, and you're here or wherever you choose to worship, and then we move very quickly back to everyday life and routine. And no judgment, it's just I do it. We move back in and out. I remember one year I gave up eating chocolate for an entire year. I don't know why. Like, why would you get married? Why would you ever do that? Like, I don't know why. Yeah, you wouldn't. See, smart. Yeah, you wouldn't do it. That's the wisdom. I can't remember why I did it. I don't know. I remember, like, I did, and a couple of my cousins did, and I don't know. I don't know if it was like some weird test of like willpower, like can we even do this or what? Like, I don't know. But what I do remember is scouring like every ingredient list for cocoa. I'm like, I better make sure there's no chocolate in this before I eat it. Like, that was life for a year. And what I also remember is that, like, I was very serious about it, like too serious. Just making sure, like no chocolate, no Coke, like nothing was going to enter my body right up until the end. And then what do you think happened? The year was done. And I made up for the year. Like, I made up for that entire year, probably in one day. It was like, I go a whole year incredibly serious and like hyper focused on this. I'm never going to eat chocolate for this entire year. And then like day one, I was just like right back and overindulged for sure. And again, I reflect, I go, really, like, the whole thing was rather pointless, wasn't it? Like, what's the point of doing something for an entire year like that if at the end of the day, it doesn't really change the way you live moving forward? I think the resurrection of Jesus, Easter season, as we're still in the Easter season for weeks, it either changes your life or it doesn't. And that is to say, we can either let it change our lives or not. And so what I want to do is look at a very specific moment. I think it's a moment in the disciples' lives where they're confronted with the same decision, the same reality, the same choice. Are they going to allow the resurrection of Jesus to define every aspect of their life, to set the trajectory for their lives? Are they going to let it touch every part of who they are or not? I see, because the disciples, the followers of Jesus, his friends, his family, they have, just as many of us have seen and experienced ourselves over the last few weeks, they've witnessed his death, and now they're beginning to experience his resurrection. And what happens post-empty tomb, post-Easter Sunday, post that early in the morning before it was, while it was still dark, they go to the tomb, like after all of that, Jesus begins to show up and reveal himself to his followers. He appears to Mary. He appears to two on the road to Emmaus. He appears to the disciples twice. He appears to the disciples. Once without Thomas and then once with Thomas, right? We get all these interactions between Jesus and his followers. And so Jesus dies, at least in the way John tells the story. Jesus dies. He's buried. He's brought back to life, resurrection, and then he appears to Mary and the disciples. And you can read it. It goes through chapters 19 and 20. It happens over the course of about 1 week. And so when we arrive here in John 21, it's actually the third time that Jesus has appeared to his disciples. And I think in this appearance, they're confronted with a choice. And this is how it reads. In my Bible, it's called Jesus and the Miraculous Catch of Fish. And in 21, it starts, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, that just means the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and you can, if you're reading in a real Bible, you can write like James and John. That's the names, James and John. And two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So the disciples, many of whom, and this is important, were fishermen. Post-resurrection of Jesus, they go out to fish. And like I said, it's important who these disciples are, especially Simon Peter and James and John, or how they're called, the sons of Zebedee in particular, because like I said, they were fishermen before they were called to be disciples, before they were called to be students of Jesus, before they came and followed him. They were fishermen. And they had to leave their job of fishermen in order to do it. Right? And in Matthew's account, there's that great line where Jesus says, I will teach you to fish for people, or in older versions of English, I will make you fishers of men. And so they go and they leave. And it actually says, like, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, like, they actually leave their father in the boat. They're like, wait, well, we see you. Like, we're going to go. We're going to follow this guy. And that's how they are called initially to become followers of Jesus. And so the disciples in John 21, they're not simply going to fish. They're returning to fish. They're going back to something from before their lives, their times as followers of Jesus. Which I think, at least when I read it, it begs the question, why? Like, why are they returning? There's got to be some motivation there, some reason, maybe multiple layers of it. Now, I don't blame the disciples. I don't blame them one bit for returning to fish. Like, we can be hard on the disciples, but it does make me curious. And I do think that there's something that we can learn from them. And so I go through these different options. Maybe they're returning to what they know, to what they knew before their lives as followers of Jesus, because it's comfortable. I don't mean that in a bad way, but because it gives them comfort. Like, it gives them something to do in the midst of figuring out what has just happened. Like, what were those 3 years about? And what does Jesus' death mean? And he's starting to show up, and we're hearing about his resurrection, and we've seen him. Like, what is going on? Into all this upheaval, like, it's entirely possible to say, hey, we're going back to something comfortable, because I know that I like things that are comfortable when I go through seasons that are difficult in my life. Like, if something is in turmoil, I go, I'm going to make sure everything else in my life is as comfortable as possible so that I can face this moment of upheaval, of uncertainty. I'm pretty sure that's why the term comfort food exists, right? Like, that's big. We have got habits. We have things we do consciously, unconsciously when we're stressed or anxious or worried that help to calm and that help to comfort in moments of uncertainty and upheaval. So maybe fishing is comfortable for the disciples. Maybe it allows them to process what's going on, possible. Maybe it's their happy place, right? Maybe, though, and I wonder, if the disciples are afraid of ultimately what the resurrection could mean for their lives. And I wonder if returning to fish, and this is why they kind of can get themselves into trouble with people, maybe they're trying to run away from it. Like, I wonder if it's a moment in their lives similar to Jonah. And so Jonah, we hear about in the Old Testament, God says, go. And so what does he do? He jumps on a boat and he goes in the other direction. Right? God calls him. He says, go to Nineveh. He's like, I don't want any part of those guys. I'm going to go in the opposite direction. And it's actually, when you read it, it's so wild, the whole story. Like, it is intentionally comedic of how different his action is compared to what God calls him to do and what he actually does. And I wonder if there's some of this same fear and worry and anxiety going on in the disciples, because if the resurrection really happened, then it will change and has changed everything for the disciples. Nothing will be the same again. And I wonder if there's just a little bit of fear and trepidation at that reality. I wonder for us, too. In the same way, if we kind of move through Easter and then easily go back to routine and in some ways avoid wrestling with if this really happened, what does it need to change about the way I'm currently living my life? Because if the resurrection is really real, like it demands the entirety of your life. Everything that Jesus lived and taught becomes true for you and for the world, and it forces you to grapple with sin and with death in a new way. And it also demands that you give up on old ways of living. Something will change. A third option is that the disciples are simply hungry. And like there's one commentator who just writes, he's like, hey, they had a free meal ticket for 3 years. He's gone. So what else are they going to do? They go back to what they were good at and they get fish. Except that they don't. And that's just this line that John throws in. That night they caught nothing. I don't know for sure. I'm not saying that one of those options is necessarily the true option, absolutely. We don't know. No motivation is given for their journey out onto the lake in the middle of the night, going to fish, except that it happens, and they catch nothing, and then Jesus shows up for them in the morning. And so in verse 4, we pick it up. It says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. That's a common theme that we see in Jesus' first encounters with people post-resurrection. So we have Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Jesus shows up and she's like pleading with them, please, like if you know where they've taken him, would you tell me? And then Jesus speaks her name and she realizes she's open to the reality that it's Jesus. And in the same way, in 5, he calls out to the disciples. He says, friends, haven't you any fish? And I like it. It's like in the negative. It's like, have you caught anything? I don't know. Like I mean, I don't know that I would be as bold as Jesus standing on the shore and be like, these guys are out all night fishing and they're the professional fishermen. And you're standing there going like, hey, lads, which is actually the proper translation. Like lads, almost like, hey kids, like haven't you got, like, don't you have any fish? I go, okay, bold. Like I'm definitely not going to stand on the side of farmers' fields and go like, hey, that's not a great yield of wheat, is it? Like I don't have a sweet clue what I'm doing. So, anyways, I find that it's this call into this very weird scenario because they immediately go, no, we don't. And again, like they don't know. And so then Jesus says, throw your net in the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Again, I go, this is a little bit strange because it actually works. Again, like I don't know that I'm going to be the one saying like, hey, did you try like the other side of the boat? I'm like, no, we didn't think of that. I don't know. Except that again, like this is how John records it. It says they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. There's this line that echoes in this moment when you're reading through where earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells those same disciples, he says, apart from me, you can do nothing. And the implication is with me, anything becomes possible. One of the strongest promises toward the end of the Gospel accounts of Jesus' life is his promise of the presence of God. The gift of the Holy Spirit. Jesus says, behold, I am with you. I will be with you always to the end of the age. And again, it's in this conversation that the disciples begin to realize that it's Jesus. So in 7, when the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. Right? As soon as Simon Peter heard him say it, it's the Lord. He wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. So this is maybe a little bit of a bold, rash reaction. There's not too much going on here other than like if you think about it this way, if you're wearing a bathrobe loose and you didn't want to take it off to jump in the water, you would tighten it up. That's essentially what's happening. He jumps in the water. The other disciples, though, they followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish they were not far off from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And it's into that moment that, what happens is they share a meal with Jesus, even some of the fish. And Jesus begins again to remind them of who they are, of who they were called to be. And I think of me anyways, I know of my own life. Like I read this interaction between Jesus and the disciples, now bookending their sort of discipleship, called from being fishermen to being his followers and his friends, his disciples. And then at the end, again, this reaffirmation that they are called to something new, to something greater, to something different. On Monday morning after Easter, did you wake up and return to what you know? And listen, like I get it, for some of us it was a holiday, or for others, like we were at home with kids and grandkids who were off from school. And so you're like, no, everything was different. But like on Tuesday and on Wednesday, and how about a week later, like where these disciples are, has something changed? Or today, 2 weeks out, like the disciples, like have you allowed yourself to really wrestle with what the resurrection means for your everyday life? Not even necessarily what all of it means, but if you will allow it to change something. If you will allow it to change something of your everyday life, what is the resurrection of Jesus calling you to do? How is it calling you to live? Are you living differently because of it? Or do you want to live differently because of it? Jesus called the disciples out of their proper professions, a fisherman, tax collector, and into something new. And so I've got to wonder that maybe this is a season where God is calling you into something new. Maybe this is a season where God is calling us into something new, to give up old ways of living and to enter into something. And maybe it's not a new profession, maybe it is. What would it look like for you to step into what God is calling you to do, your vocation? Frederick Buechner writes about calling and vocation and work that we do as followers of Jesus, and he has got this great line. He says, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." I'll read it again. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I love that quote because I think it reminds you that God has actually given you something to do and for you to do uniquely in this world with your life. And then he's asking you to step boldly into it. And maybe for you, this is a season where God is saying, hey, I've got something new for you. And you don't know exactly what it is, but I'm calling you to step out. Immediately after this whole meal that Jesus has with his disciples is where he reinstates Peter. And so it's this line to Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And then he says, "Feed my sheep." 3 times he says, feed my sheep, take care of my lambs, feed my sheep. And it's Peter who Jesus called rock and promised to build his church. It's Peter who also denied Jesus, who denied knowing him during his trial and crucifixion because he was afraid for his own life. It's the same Peter who walked on water for a split second. And it's the same Peter who jumped into the water to reach Jesus just a little bit ahead of everybody else. A Peter who Jesus calls to feed my sheep, take care of my lambs. For Peter and for the other disciples, it's a moment of reminding them who Jesus is and then also who they are. Whose they are. And out of that, what they are called to do. Long after Jesus leaves, they are still called to live as followers of Jesus. They are still called to spread the good news. They're still called to talk about his resurrection and to work toward building his kingdom on earth. It doesn't change whether Jesus is physically present with them or not. A great thing for us, for you who calls yourself a follower of Jesus, you're still called into that same thing. To become like Jesus, to follow in his way, to build kingdom, to work in the way that God has created you to work. The way I read this post-Easter, post-resurrection story is almost like a fork in the road for the disciples. Almost like a tipping point. Like, will they allow Jesus and his resurrection and his kingdom to continue to define their lives? Or are they going to allow their lives to be defined by something else? One of the questions that I've been wrestling through, a number of them anyways, as I read my way through John 21, is what the greatest thing in my life is. And I would ask you that question, like, what is the greatest thing in your life? And maybe once you've wrestled with and sat with that question for a minute or a few, if you're like me, it takes a while. How would your spouse, your partner answer that question on your behalf, of you? How about your kids or your grandkids? Each one of us, each one of you is called to be or become a follower of Jesus. Like I believe that is true. The resurrection confronts us with a similar fork in the road and hopefully tipping point. Like, what is God calling you to give up? What is God calling you to step into? What newness does God have laid out before you for the sake of kingdom and for the sake of following him? And maybe this is a moment where God is saying to you again, come, follow me. It's time for you to walk. It's time for you to walk away from sin and walk into freedom. It's time for you to walk away from who you have been living into and into the ways and the person that I've created you to be. It's time to walk into doing the things I've created you to do with all of your life, not just a part. Maybe it is because I've done a lot of funerals lately, and maybe this sermon did just take a morbid turn, like right from the very beginning of it. But I've been thinking a lot about how people are going to remember me when I die. Because I've been thinking a lot about the people I remember long after their death and how I remember them and what stays with me. Now, hopefully that moment for me is a long, long, long time from now. But how is it that you want to be remembered? There's a hymn written by Isaac Watts, which, if you know much about hymnody, is a hilarious statement because there's actually over 750 hymns written by Isaac Watts. The last line of one of my favorites reads this way. It says, "Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all." And what I hope that is remembered is not, in fact, what I do. I hope what is remembered is who I became, more and more like Jesus. I hope what is remembered is not any virtue or good nature, but simply Christ's love. And what I hope that is remembered of you is the same. Christ's love in you, to define you, and to hold you, and to keep you, and through you, to be shown to the world.